Yeah, let's get back
I've
to,
made you a co-host already. Try it and see. I'll tweak it if it doesn't work.
It's not working right now.
How funny. Okay, so let me try again. We've had some glitches going here. Okay.
Oh, here we go.
All right.
Hmm. So I put together a little PowerPoint, some slides to kind of put the subject matter in context and provide some examples of what the state has done, what other states are doing, what EPA is doing, and how the whole issue really depends on how you define PFAS. So what is PFAS generally? It's a large group of synthetic chemicals, been used since the 50s in all sorts of consumer products. Nonstick cookware was a big one in the 70s and 80s. Gore-Tex and rain-resistant jackets is a big one, which the industry is moving away from. Um, uh, Stain resistance, firefighting foam, etc. They have a linked carbon and fluorine atom, and that is one of the strongest chemical bonds that exist. And therefore, it's very difficult for them to degrade in the environment. And that's why they're referred to as forever chemicals, because they don't degrade and they stick around in the environment for a long, long time. So
Just quickly, Mike, so is it that molecular sort of thumbprint, blueprint, whatever it is, that really defines the universe of them?
we're going to get to that in a minute.
Okay.
It depends on which formula, which one you look at. So why is PFAS an issue? It has identifiable health impacts. It can increase the chance of cancer. It can affect your immune system and your body's ability to fight disease. It can decrease fertility and increase blood pressure. It causes developmental issues. And those risks from PFAS, because PFAS is continuously in the environment, they are expected to continue to recur and to recur at a level that it is largely undetectable in both the environment and in the body. So how PFAS are regulated really depends on how you define them. And there's three major ways to define them. And I give examples of each. The first is just to list the specific PFAS that you want to regulate and or prohibit. An example of that is US EPA in 2024. They set maximum contaminant levels for 5 specific types of PFAS and listed them out and listed the parts per trillion that were allowable in safe drinking water from that point on. So very specific. And you have done that. Vermont has done that too, with also with drinking water, but also with hazardous waste, what's also called the I rule, which is how you clean up contaminated properties. They have the specific chemical that's listed and the threshold amount that's allowable for those specific chemicals. The second major way is US EPA's definition. And this is a definition based on the chemical structure, one of 3 different chemical structures. So it's not just the fluorine and the carbon fuse, it's the fluorine and carbon fuse in one of these 3 structures. And so that's how it's defined under the Federal Toxic Substances Control Act. The General Assembly, in the data center bill, this is how you define PFAS for the purpose of that bill. And that was chosen, that definition was chosen because you can actually monitor for these PFAS. EPA has a methodology for monitoring for these. When you monitor for just the fluorinated carbon atom, you basically have to test for fluorine, and which is overbroad in its testing application because not everything that has fluorine in it is a PFAS. So you're just out there kind of casting about to see if you can detect any PFAS, and you're not using a specific methodology. But this methodology, the flip side, it only tests for about 50 different PFAS. So you don't get the broad universe of testing, but you're not overbroad either. And that's going to be important in a minute.
So Mike, at 50 out of how many, say?
I'm going to get to that in a minute.
Okay.
So the third definition is this general definition we've already touched on. It's a class of fluorinated organic chemicals containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. This is the definition that Vermont uses in its consumer products laws regulating PFAS because it is the broadest definition. But those consumer product laws are also restricted in a way, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. So why does it matter what the definition is? Like, obviously, if you're just picking 4 or 5 PFAS, that's a pretty big difference. The US EPA definition results in about 1,400 to 1,500 different chemicals, whereas the general definition, the one fluorinated carbon atom, that's 15,000 different chemicals. So how you run a program and the resources you need, the capacities, the enforcement, really is dictated by how you define what PFAS is. And if you're like a regulatory agency, which definition would you want? You probably would want the 5, and so that's easy, identifiable, measurable. But if you're a consumer advocate, you want the 15,000. And EPA falls kind of in the lower range of the middle there.
I mean, you're probably going to get to this. How many chemicals in using Vermont's definition? You have the general, you have EPA.
15,000. That's Vermont's definition. The general definition is 15,000. But, in the data center law, you used US EPAs, and that was only 1,500. In the drinking water law, you use the 6. In Vermont, you have 6 PFAS, and they have their own threshold levels.
The data center law, I'm not remembering where PFAS came into that.
So data centers need a sufficient or a significant amount of cooling capacity to cool their servers and computers and thresholds, AI. PFAS is a very, very good coolant or heat resistor, depending on which PFAS you are using. So if you are using what's called a closed loop system to cool your data center, you can't really use a lot of water, or you use a reduced amount of water, and you then use a coolant like PFAS, or you have PFAS built into your system. And then if there is ever a discharge of that, the PFAS would be discharged into water. And so what the data center law said is that you can't discharge PFAS, which means you're going to need filtration, and you're going to have a monitoring plan to monitor for PFAS to ensure that you are not discharging any past the filtration. So that's how PFAS came in to data center.
And then for the purposes of that legislation, we use the general definition.
Now, for the purposes of that, you use the US EPA definition, because for monitoring, you have 2 US EPA monitoring methods that are approved and implementable. You have the one that will monitor for about 50 PFAS. And then you have one that will monitor for fluorinated chemicals. And so it will be up to the data center which one of those that they would use, because the data center is supposed to submit a monitoring plan to A&R for purposes of monitoring any discharges to state surface.
This is a hypothetical data center that,
Right. I mean,
yeah.
it's all very hypothetical right now. There are data centers, but they're well below the threshold that's in the data center bill.
Richard,
Yeah, thank you. Glycol. Is that a PFAS or is that its own class?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because
what is it, Richard?
glycol, so in our chiller at the farm, we use a food grade glycol. It goes through water first, section, drops the milk down to 65, 70 degrees, and then it hits glycol. And when it comes out the other end of that plate, it's 38 degrees. So I can never understand why at these data centers, they don't use glycol. Because that cools things down.
That's a good question. I don't know why. Some of them have wanted to use water, just water. But the volume that they were using was amazing. And so they moved to these closed loop systems with the chemicals, which reduces water usage by 70%, but it has that other consequence of using a chemical. And I don't know why they wouldn't use glycol. I mean, it's been used in equipment for a long time. Basically. So as the chair referenced, in 2023, there was an attempt at a more comprehensive program for PFAS regulation in the state. And it dealt with both the Agency of Agriculture and the Agency of Natural Resources and the Attorney General. And it was basically a report back on how to manage PFAS and consumer products in the state through a kind of more of a general regulatory program. And A&R and the AG and the Agency of Ag conferred over the summer, and they reported back and they proposed that A&R would be the one to regulate PFAS and consumer products. And they proposed language, they proposed legislation to do so, but they define PFAS as the US EPA definition, the 1500 universe of PFAS and not the 15,000. And then they define PFAS to mean those consumer products that was manufactured after the effective date where PFAS was intentionally added. So if you had PFAS in a product because maybe PFAS was in the water you used for processing, and that's how it got into the product. Maybe PFAS was in the container and it leached into your product and wasn't intentionally added. So those wouldn't be covered. Only those where the manufacturer or processor had intentionally added the PFAS to the product. Well, A&R was really adamant that they wouldn't do a program if the General Assembly chose to use the broad general definition of 15,000 chemicals. They said that they wouldn't be able to run the program. They wouldn't have enough people to run the program. They wouldn't have enough scientists to run the program. And they just basically said, we are not doing it. So instead, the General Assembly pivoted to basically what it had done in the past in regulating specific consumer products with intentionally added PFAS in them using that broad definition of PFAS. It's broad, but it had to have been intentionally added into the product. And so,
Like, just quickly, when you have, say, PFAS levels, exceeding the parts per trillion, is there a way to filter them out or reverse osmosis them? And then, I'm sure that Casella isn't just carting them away to Coventry. There must be a whole industry now of PFAS. you know, whatever that is, removal and storage, permanent storage?
Well, pretty much every university, like engineering, science-based university around the country has a pilot project going on where they're testing out different equipment and technologies to try to remove PFAS from water or from soil or from waste. And one of them that potentially could get piloted in Vermont would be at Coventry. They're looking into potentially doing a pilot project there for removal, because right now what they're doing is filtration and capture. And that doesn't eliminate the PFAS. It just means that they have to be transferred somewhere else for management and disposition. But they were previously discharging them into waters through wastewater treatment plants, and they're not doing that anymore. So,
To not do that.
yeah, it's within the past year.
Clear.
Yeah, yeah. And then they were taking it to Plattsburgh for a little bit, and then that stopped.
Black truck of death.
And now there's an Act 250 condition that says they can't discharge. So they have to manage it probably through trucking and transport and management of hazardous waste facility. So here are some of the things that Vermont regulates that have intentionally added PFAS. Firefighting foam, firefighter turnout gear, the stuff that's underneath their protective equipment, direct contact food packaging, rugs, carpets, and aftermarket water resistant treatments, ski wax, cosmetics and menstrual products, adult mattresses, apparel, artificial turf, cookware, incontinency protection products, juvenile products, textiles. Dental floss is on the list now. Certain types of fluorinated containers are on the list now. And then last year you sped up the regulation of PFAS in firefighting personal protective equipment, because when you first regulated it, there weren't readily available alternatives, PFAS-free alternatives. And as I said, this stuff is really good against heat resistance and was very ubiquitous in firefighting equipment. And so they've found a supplier that's providing it PFAS-free with the same effectiveness. And so that you sped up the ban on PFAS and firefighting equipment. But the one of the questions that came out of the Act, was it 121, the Act 121, Act number 54, sorry. The Act number 54 report was that there was supposed to be a report back on whether and how the state should regulate PFAS and pesticides. And again, this depends on how you define PFAS, because EPA did a study of its pesticides and said there are no PFAS in EPA regulated pesticide. They said that using their definition of PFAS with one of the three chemical structures, that there are no PFAS in pesticides that are regulated by EPA. And they called it a hoax that others were saying that there were PFAS in pesticides. Well, one of the leading state entities on PFAS and PFAS and pesticides is Minnesota. They've done a ton of work on PFAS. They have done multiple studies. One of their studies looked at the active and inert ingredients in pesticides regulated in Minnesota to see if they could identify any PFAS, and they did. And they identified, depending on who you talk to, between 12 and 35 chemicals. This from Minnesota's Department of Ag says they identified 12, but there's some resources out there that said that they were in the high 30s. But what did Minnesota use as their definition of PFAS? They said a class of fluorinated organic chemicals containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. So not what EPA used. They used the general definition, where EPA used the one of 3 chemical compounds. And so that kind of highlights kind of the distinction in the regulation and how people categorize pesticides and whether or not they have PFAS in them, because it really depends on how you define it. And this is going to be an issue probably regionally, definitely regionally, probably nationally, ultimately in Vermont. And it's already playing out in Maine. So in 2022, Maine enacted probably one of the most ambitious PFAS laws, banning all products with intentionally added PFAS by 2030. And they use the broad definition of PFAS, not the TSCA definition, the EPA definition. But what that has led to is it has led to tension between the agricultural industry and those who are regulating PFAS. And that tension played out recently when the Maine Board of Pesticides approved the use of pesticides that contain PFAS. And it's pretty clear, confirmed that they do have PFAS in them using that broad definition. Now, that 2030 ban on intentionally added PFAS is still in place and will apply in Maine in 2030, but you see how people are trying to still use PFAS and PFAS products, even though maybe it's not inevitable, maybe because they're regulating them now, and maybe if they're monitoring their use, they'll be able to say, PFAS isn't getting into the environment, but you have this tension, and I'm providing it as an example of the tension that's out there between those who, in some instances, like pesticides, need to use these chemicals, and those who want them completely banned because of the impact that they have on the environment. And so that's really the end of my slides, but I do want to touch on the issue of PFAS in manure and septage that's applied to farm fields. The Agency of Natural Resources has been moving away from the use of septage on farm fields because of the issue with PFAS. PFAS is in all of us because it has been in the environment since the 50s, and it's largely something we have just ingested or respirated for years. So it's in our waste, and it needs to be managed in a way that it doesn't lead to further contamination through land application. Maine was the best or most notorious example of that farm where they were applying septage, tested off the charts for PFAS. There's PFAS in the milk of the cows. There was concern that they might have to shut that farm down. I don't know ultimately what they did with that farm, but that's the kind of thing that happens. And I know ANR has some, an Agency of Ag has some concerns too, because remember the I can't even remember what they call it. It was used for food composting. They would take food residuals from wherever they were collecting them, and they would grind it up into a material that was then proposed for application. But they couldn't sort out all like the plastic wrapping and the yogurt cups and et cetera. And so that got ground up into the material too. And there was concern that applying that was not just applying microplastics to the ground, but I was also potentially applying PFAS and other chemicals. So I don't think that that equipment is in use anymore, but it's something that people will probably work to address because of the need to process food residuals in this state and others, while not creating a further contaminant source. So that's where PFAS is. You'll probably see some additional PFAS legislation this year. The AG wants some conforming amendments to some of the things that you legislated a few years ago. So they want all the definitions and the standards to be similar, enforcement to be similar. And so they're probably going to look for something at some point this session.
Richard, then John.
In Maine, as I understand it, that farm's been condemned.
I knew that's where it was going, but I wasn't sure.
Also, I believe it wasn't septic, but it was a sludge from a paper mill, I think.
I think it was both, wasn't
It
it?
might have been both. I know there was a paper mill
Yeah.
involved in it. And it must have been one of the 5 they can test that they found it, and they did find it in the milk, and it was
It's an organic farm, right?
yeah, and that doesn't matter if organic or inorganic or conventional or whatever you want to call it. It was a dang shame that it happened. And sludge was spread everywhere in the state of Vermont in the 70s. And that makes me question why the brown bullheads and stuff, they have cancerous lesions on them. Because one of the sites was up beside what is now Casella landfill. What, was spread on the airport at that time. So, the 5 tested chemicals they can find is,
Well, there's more than 5 that they can test for. The EPA method, using the EPA definition, their monitoring kicks back around 45 to 50.
okay, all right, yeah,
And then if you want to go beyond that, you have to use the EPA method that's testing just for the presence of fluorine.
yeah. Okay,
And I have those methods with me if you want.
and by the way, the glycol that we use to cool our milk is propylene glycol, not ethylene glycol. Ethylene glycol is uranium freeze, which is very toxic. And propylene glycol is food very fast.
I mean, that's the one for fluorine, and this is the one for the specific PFAS in water, solids, biosolids, and tissue. So they're a little dense, but they do help kind of understand how they do the monitoring.
John,
Like, do you know more about, when we were just getting an overview of PFAS in pesticides? Is it used as, almost an amendment to other pesticides to make them work better? Or are there some PFAS, sort of as the active ingredient that really does the job?
Well, that's what Minnesota was trying to figure out, and they did. And I'll have to go and find the results of that study. They did find some that they concluded were active ingredients, that they had PFAS added to the more recognizable active ingredient for the properties that PFAS gives it. PFAS makes things more pliable. It makes it more slippery. It makes it more, pourable.
It doesn't degrade, right?
Right.
And then the other issue is the HDPE plastics, right, which you reference in heat stuff, right?
Right.
For that,
Right.
there's a lot of PFAS in that too, right?
Right. And so a few years ago, when the issue of pesticides, PFAS and pesticides first arose, EPA thought it was from the containers, the leaching in from the containers. And they they banned certain containers, and then one of the leading container manufacturers voluntarily moved to a new type of container that didn't have PFAS in it. But that wasn't every type, because those were generally the consumer related products and not the bulk products, which come in those cubes. And there's assertion that those cubes have PFAS in them and are leaching into the pesticide. That's an assertion though, because remember, if you're EPA, you say they don't have PFAS in them because it's not one of the three chemical structures that's in there. It's just a fluorinated carbon atom that's in there.
It's not intentionally added.
It's not intentionally added.
If it comes off of the back. Right.
Just fluoride in drinking water. Does that and create any sort of challenges in monitoring drinking
No,
water?
I think it's a different compound. Remember, it's got to have that carbon and fluorine compound that are fused. That makes it the PFAS. And so I can't say never that fluoride isn't gonna.
We've got Matt Chapman coming in later.
Right.
Maybe he could.
I'm just curious in terms of testing.
Right.
Because if the other 15,000 chemicals that aren't the 50 that have molecules that can be isolated, does that mean that there's roughly 15,000 that, if we're just trying to find fluorine, wouldn't
Right.
that be more on itself? Fluorine versus fluoride, I don't know how you do it. Anyway,
Right.
it's a question, but
And I can send you all these resources. I've got Maine's PFAS and pesticide scientific studies. I've got National Institute of Health studies, things of that kind that can help. I also, Matt let me use some of his slides on a presentation he did last year. So some of this you might see from Matt as well, because
Okay.
I stole some of his
Okay.
slides.
Not that he stole from you, so we have that straight then.
Right.
Good. Do you know, so it strikes me that anybody thinking about this would want to understand the health impacts of the 1,500 or the 5 even, and the 1,500 versus the 15,000. So they're all forever chemicals. I guess maybe that's the one thing they have in common is that they don't break down. But has the case been made to the state and when we've had these other bills passed that we should be using that broader definition because they're all bad? Or was that case not made and we were just making assumptions?
I mean, the case was definitely made, and particularly in the Senate Health and Welfare Committee, where there was arguments and requests from industry advocates not to use the broader definition, to use the EPA definition because of regulatory predictability. But the committee downstairs specifically said that they wanted to be as protective of health as possible. You still wind up limiting the universe of what's regulated by saying intentionally added.
Yeah.
But then you also prohibit those products from having intentionally added PFAS in them, depending on the timeline. And the timelines are all different depending on the product.
If we're getting too far out of your area of expertise, feel free to say so, but I'm thinking about the Olympians who were banned from skiing because their skis were tested and they had PFAS in the wax. And I think they said, well, we didn't know that. And
right. I mean, some of the sports governing bodies have implemented standards, especially in those countries where PFAS has been banned, and things like ski wax and a couple of other products.
but there's a test. So, and I don't know whether the PFAS and ski wax are which ones they are, right? Whether they fit the EPA definition or not. But presumably they were able to test for them on site
Yeah,
using well, some.
they probably had something that reacted with fluorinated compounds.
I think, yeah, it would be helpful for us or anyone who wants to dig into this more to hear from somebody in the medical world about the health effects of this group of PFAS that the EPA defines versus the broader impact.
Yep, and your fellow committees have done that before, and I can go back through some of the witness testimony and get recommended people, recommended witnesses.
And when Matt's in later, we can find out more about the water testing on those 5 chemicals, and why it's those 5.
Right, I mean, Vermont was one of the first to go with, in 2017, with the drinking water standards. We're supposed to have surface water standards too, but it's more difficult because there is no regional standard, and you usually, when you do surface water standards, you start with a baseline of a regional standard, and there is none right now. But yeah, I think Matt started with 5 and now they're up to 6. And, they were the ones that were prevalent and identifiable.
Did anybody else have a question? Just going back to John's earlier question about what's happening now, maybe you answered this and I didn't quite get it, with systems that filter out PFAS, where does that PFAS that they've collected end up?
It gets collected wherever there's filtration. So, I do think 1 or 2 wastewater treatment plants have them, and I do know that the landfill has one. What they do with it from that point, I don't know. It was being sent to other wastewater treatment plants for discharge, but that aggravated many people. And Representative Nelson referenced there were several studies done in the Northeast Kingdom or proximate to, and there were abnormal results for multiple types of fish species, specifically the brown bullhead and the cancerous lesions that are found effectively nowhere else. And that was very concerning to certain people in that area.
Was there testimony also in the past about how the human body absorbs PFAS, the rates at which, for example, drinking a glass of water versus cooking in a pan, a Teflon pan?
I mean, I've heard some of the advocates, especially representing industry, saying that they've responded in a way that prevents the leaching of the chemicals from cookware or from food storage, etc. But there are others that will argue that it's still, because of its contact nature, because it can be scraped or cut or gouged, that it's always going to be a source. But I can't recall anything about rate of assimilation based on your source.
It seems like if you're eating food or drinking water, that way, pretty concentrated.
Mhm.
If it's ski wax, and maybe the concern there is the snow melts and it just moves into.
It was in groundwater and surface water.
John?
I think we saw it described somewhere, it's an endocrine disruptor. So what does that mean?
It disrupts your reproductive systems. Like it can both be disruptive to female and male reproductive systems. They're integral in the proper functioning of your systems. And then well, there you go. Just Representative Bartholomew, you wanna?
Well, endocrine is the reproductive hormones, but they're all any hormone in your body, an endocrine disruptor could potentially disrupt. So it's not just the reproductive hormones, it's any hormone.
And
Growth hormone, for example, we talked about growth rate. That's not a reproductive hormone, so
And this is their talent for binding too? Is that connected to this? Like that?
I mean, their binding is what makes them persist, both in your body and in the environment. I don't think, I don't know enough about whether or not the binding effect of them is contributing to the health effects.
Yeah, thank you. What were the levels of the PFAS found down in Bennington County? When they had, was that from the makers of a Teflon plant down there, or was it fire? Teflon, wasn't it?
It was Saint-Gobain, the plant right over the border in New York.
It was in New York, okay.
And they were very, very high.
Way above the parts per trillion you showed us earlier.
Yes.
In groundwater?
It was,
And in blood. The theory is that they've been exposed to groundwater and the people there for decades. And what happened is that it was supposed to combust and break down and then either be filtered or emitted into the air in safe amounts, and but it wasn't combusting and it wasn't being fully filtered, and so it was through rain and air deposition, it was spread all over the area and contaminated the groundwater and some surface waters.
The Saint-Gobain's plant in Bennington, which made, I think, if I remember, it was like the roof for the Astrodome. That's what they were generating there. So big, large sheets of it. And the neighbors right around there were testing like maybe close to 4 figures. And like definitely up in the high hundreds parts per trillion.
if you get in a four
In
figure.
the well water, no,
Yeah,
that's,
yeah, and then you get to 4 figures, you're in parts per billion.
yes, right.
Yeah.
But,
just to be clear about endocrine disruptors, it's not just PFAS that are endocrine disruptors. There are others, the plastics and all kinds of stuff, pesticides. I've got a list here, heavy metals, stuff used in rocket fuel and fireworks and preservatives and just all kinds of stuff can be. It's not just PFAS.
Right.
It can-
Great, we just sent a ship to the moon and spread its glory all over all of us.
contaminating all those space aliens.
anything else, Mike?
Just, do you know anything about, you may not, just in terms of research into alternatives to PFAS lined containers? Presumably they use them for a reason, line them, but I'm not sure they have a good reason. Is it just cheaper to do it that way than finding another container, or there are alternatives being researched for?
Do you mean any container, or do you mean for food packaging?
Any time a PFAS would be used to line a container, that manufacturer presumably had a reason to use a PFAS lined container.
Well, I mean, So fast food, the wrap around the burger, that had PFAS in it because it was pliable and moldable and foldable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't use that now.
They don't, they moved to the boxes, but some of the boxes allegedly had it in it for a while.
We keep hearing that a lot of pesticides have PFAS lined containers. Like, why do they have to have that?
Keeps them from leaking.
Well,
That's what I've been told.
is it?
We'll have Lionel in here.
So you wonder if they got a plastic, if they decided to use a plastic bottle because it's cheaper to line a plastic bottle with PFAS than it is to use a metal container.
Well, they're actually making the container with PFAS. It's not that there's necessarily a liner. And last year you prohibited chlorinated containers in like 2 or 3 years. So
Pesticides.
any container with a consumer product.
If it's sold at a retail store,
Yeah.
it qualifies. I think if it's something that you might use, sorry, I don't mean to point at you, but that,
You throw me under the bus.
that one might use, and purchased in another way, then I'm not sure it qualifies.
I mean, if you're a pesticide manufacturer, you're going to find alternatives to sell your product in a way that's allowable.
How many other states are working towards this pesticide, removing PFAS from containers?
Well, Maine and Minnesota are the leaders, but Washington, California, Oregon, those are the ones that I know.
Because if industry is gonna move, like, does my Hood Cottage cheese container contain PFAS? And if industry is gonna move, it has to be a big enough number, as we heard about baby food and whatnot, a big enough number of people to make industry to change. You know, I don't think many industries out there are gonna change for Vermont or Vermont and Maine or Vermont and New York when it comes to neonics.
Well, they have. They've been moving towards phasing them out, and some
Container, yeah.
some of the products are already prohibited from being sold with intentionally added PFAS. And yeah, as I said, Maine and Minnesota have already been leading the way. And Matt's the other guy, like he's one of the experts in the region. He's been working on it for over 10 years. He goes to all the regional conferences and knows the science better than most. And so he's definitely a great resource for the state. But he's also a regulator. So he is also like, I can't do everything you want me to do.
He might want to do all this, Sam, John.
I want to point out, though, we often point to the size of Vermont being, why would they do that for our little state? And generally, that's a good argument that we want to pay attention to because there are products that are important for our citizens. But it's not, we shouldn't underestimate our power either, because one example that comes to mind is when we passed the bill requiring labeling of genetically modified stuff. Companies complied. We were seeing packaging showing up where it was telling you. So, it's not like our voice is zero. That's the only point I want to make.
Yeah.
Matt wasn't available until 2:45 today, so he's coming in then, and we scheduled another witness to join us probably a quarter after on a different subject. So we'll have to bounce back and forth a little bit, but and that different subject is hemp or CBD. So we'll take a break. And then we'll come back and hear that testimony, and then we'll finish the day with Matt Chapman from ANR on